As a matter of fact, I'm so sick of waiters are, I think, legally mandated in the UK. I don't know if they are in the US to ask you, does anyone have any allergies?
Is that right?
Yeah, they have to ask you, do you have any allergies? And I'm like, bad service? I've had it with the service in London. You are so spoiled in New York. The service is so good.
It's true. What are some of your horror stories?
Nothing horror. I mean, it takes them more than 3 minutes to get me my second Makers and Ginger. Those are my horror stories. My worst days are better than most people's best days, but it's not. I go to this place called, since Chiltern burned down, I got to go to this place called Kensington Roof Gardens, which has way too many fucking dudes. And it's way too crowded.
Beautiful place, though. I was there over the summer. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's great for the 11 days a year you can actually go into the roof garden. But
Yeah,
otherwise, we're all crammed inside wishing that Chiltern was still open. And and I'm not exaggerating, there's 700 people lining up at the bar, 695 of them men. And you'd think, and there's like two bartenders sitting there like slicing limes very methodically and elegantly. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, dude, just start like literally spraying beers at us and we'll open our mouths. That's the thing about, that's freaked me out about the members club you're a member of, Chez Margot, because now that we're paying it.
I'm not a member of that club.
You're not? I keep seeing you there.
Yeah, I get invited by members.
Well, anyways, the thing about it is it freaked me out. I'm like, it's so young here. And then I realized it's not, the reason I think it's so young is, you know what it has? Most of these clubs have guys in their 40s and women in their 20s and 30s. And what Chez Margot has is it has a bunch of dudes in their 20s, which makes it feel like high school.
I gotta agree with you. Surely that's you're not very happy about that.
I'm fine with that. I like it. They all come up to me. I love your content on men. Hey, what's Ed like? And I literally, were you student body president or the mascot or something? Everybody knows you. And it totally bums me out because I like to get a little fucked up and talk to everyone at the bar, throw an unlit cigarette in my mouth, put on sunglasses, and just be a cliche of me. And then when people come up and say they know you, I feel as if I have to act semi-respectable. I'm like, oh, hey, hi, yeah. Oh, yeah, no, I don't know what do you think is going to be the next interest rate cut? God. They're all so fucked.
This is the trouble. You shouldn't have been a professor. You should have been like an actor or like a pop star or something. That's what you really want.
100%. I'm just not that talented, but I agree with you.
No, I think you are. You're talented in the thing. You've got a good brain. You've got a good economic brain. And really what you want to be doing is like, you've got the Bezos thing. You want to be like Justin Bieber or something.
You had me till the Justin Bieber part. I would have gone for Ryan Reynolds or George Clooney. He seems smart and very politically oriented. But the thing I hate about your friends, that's a good way to start a sentence, is they're so annoyingly earnest. Professor Calloway, it's so nice to meet you. I know Ed, he's such a good person, isn't he? Fuck off. Anyways, it's great to meet your friends out.
I've got to learn about who these friends are. I haven't been.
Yeah, your Princeton buddies. What is it, like a reading club or a drinking club? Like you guys have Pim's cups or something and play cricket?
Eating, yeah.
Is that what it is?
Eating club, that's right.
So instead of fraternities, they have eating clubs?
They actually have both.
Oh, really?
But yeah, that is what it's called. It's called an eating club.
But you were in an eating club, and you would get into anyone because of that faux British accent, which, by the way, everyone is figuring out is total bullshit.
They're on to me.
You're from Nashville. All right, enough of this. Get to the headlines.
One of our douchiest. Okay, here is our conversation with Daron Acemoglu, Nobel Prize-winning economist, New York Times best-selling author, and professor.
This is not an easy segue. Oh, God.
Nobel Prize-winning economist, New York Times best-selling author, and professor of economics at MIT. Professor Acemoglu, very good to have you on the show.
Thanks, Ed. Great being with you and Scott.
So we want to start with AI for obvious reasons. That's all we can really talk about at the moment. We've been seeing a lot of bullish sentiment in AI. We've also been seeing a lot of circular investments happening, a lot of people saying that it's a bubble. Last year, you were asked to answer on a scale of 1 to 10 how much of an impact AI is going to have on the world. And your answer at the time was -6. So we want to unpack this, starting with that hot take. What are your views on AI at this point? And do you still have a -6 rating on AI right now?
Let's break that into three pieces. One is AI a transformative technology with great capabilities? Yes. That's why it's not -1 or +1. It's -6. Second, how quickly will this technology reach fruition? And there, I think the answer is it depends on how quickly it's pushed. So I think for a positive development path, I think we need a more deliberative approach. We are rushing into AI in a way that I think makes applications using AI less likely to develop because we are just doing it too quickly. And we also don't have a roadmap of what it is that we really want from AI, while everybody recognizes that this is a technology that's going to have tremendous number of side effects, foreseen and unforeseen consequences. So all of these things, plus, very importantly for me, the focus on automation and AGI, while there are better things to do with AI, I think tip the scales towards negative. So it's -6, -5, -7, take your pick. But I'm very worried about the direction of AI, where it's much more concentrated, who uses, who controls information, and what we do with it.
Yeah, could you break down what that negative impact would actually look like? There's the aspect of the concentration of power, and I'm sure that could have many implications. We're also worried about it. There is the implication of automation and the idea that this would replace labor, it would replace people's jobs. Say more about how it goes from -1 to -6 in your view. What is that destructive impact that you're so worried about?
In the production domain, if we use AI mostly for automation, I think not only would we be missing some of the really transformative uses of it, but we would create much smaller productivity gains than expected. And we would also create various social outcomes that are negative related to job loss for certain groups, lack of employment opportunities for certain groups, wage stagnation or declines like we've experienced in the 1990s. All of these are on the negative part related to the production process. But I'm also very worried about the fact that AI is first and foremost a communication technology. And as a communication technology, it changes political and social dynamics. And when it centralizes information in the hands of a few companies, it can have a variety of very negative effects on democracy, on dissent, on diversity, a variation in opinion, all sorts of things that we are really not prepared for.
What would you say to someone who would say that you are being a Luddite? Or, I mean, we've seen transformative technologies in the past, whether it be oil or the electric grid or the internet. And it seems as though when these transformative technologies come along, there is a lot of concern about what it will do to our economy and how it will negatively impact our economy. But many people would say, well, eventually it works out and we shouldn't be so worried about technology. What do you say to those people?
Well, there are really two theories that people could have about long-run effects of technologies in general. The first one is that in the long run, things will work out by themselves. Let it rip. And just the dynamics of things, for example, in the labor market or via democratic processes, sometimes semi-democratic processes, is that we'll just find the right way of dealing with things. The second one is that, no, it's a deliberative set of choices that we have to make in order to make sure that the long-run effects are better than the short-run ones. And I think if you look at several transformative technologies, indeed, they did have fairly negative short-run effects. The beginning of the British Industrial Revolution is associated, depending on how you measure it, 70, 80, 90 years of real wage declines or stagnation and huge increases in inequality. The transition out of agriculture similarly at first created quite a lot of social and economic hardship. But in both cases, later adaptation worked out much better. But I would say, even though decisions were made without a roadmap, there were specific decisions about how to use technology, how to change the organization of production, and also political decisions that were quite important. And so it's not an automatic process. So I'm not an AI pessimist. And so I don't know what your definition of Luddite is, but I'm not an AI pessimist. But I do not believe that we're going to get the best out of AI or even the second best out of AI if we just say, oh, let's not worry about all the disruptions. Somehow things are going to work out.
So it feels as if a lot of the concern or discussion around AI has moved towards who can secure reliable, large amounts of electrons or energy. One, is this an attempt, it sounds like, do you think this is an attempt to paint a future where the demand's going to be unlimited and a bit of a head fake? Or do you see the same sort of power constraints that these guys are seeing? And what do you see as kind of the downstream impact of that?
I do not believe that power, GPU capacity is the main limiting factor for the kind of AI that I have in mind. Because if we're going to make AI really serve our needs, I think it needs to have much more human complementary domain-specific expertise. It has to be able to be an aid to electricians, to accountants, to journalists, to academics. And for that, high-quality domain-specific information, data, is going to be the real scarce resource. Whereas right now, the energy demand is mostly from foundation models that are very impressive in some ways, but also very, very expensive to run and have not reliably reached that context-specific, domain-relevant expertise. So I think we have to find a way of getting the best out of foundation models, but combine them with domain-specific models.
What I've also seen is that a lot of the different LLMs are hitting sort of a technical parity, by most kind of, I don't know, hardcore metrics. Do you think there's a scenario? We had Robert Armstrong from the FT on several times, and he said that there's certain technologies where no one or small set of companies is able to ring fence stakeholder and therefore shareholder value. That the airlines, PCs, vaccines were huge innovations, but you didn't have a small number of companies garnering trillions of dollars in market cap. Do you think this might qualify as one of those industries where even if it ends up having a huge impact on society, that we're overestimating the ability of a small number of companies to capture a ton of shareholder value?
I would be very worried about an industry that is so concentrated. On the other hand, it's a cutthroat industry, and we don't understand what sort of industrial organization of AI is going to emerge. So it is almost certain that whoever is doing the foundation models advances is not going to be the same company that also does all of the applications. So you're going to form an AI stack. So once you form that AI stack, where are the risks going to reside, and which layer of the stack is going to get most of the returns? I think that remains to be seen. It's going to depend on where the real bottleneck is in terms of doing useful things, and whether the foundation models are close substitutes for each other when it comes to serving as the first layer of that stack. I think those are really interesting questions. And it is made more interesting by the fact that industries that look very competitive at some point later on can be very non-competitive, because early competition is about being the one that controls things later on. That's why it's so vicious, because everybody thinks that they're going to get the prize, and the prize is dominate the industry. So I don't know whether the competition that you're seeing right now is going to repeat itself in 10 years' time, or whether we're going to go to a winner takes all sort of structure at the foundation layer.
Yeah, in your book, Power and Progress, you basically take us through history and the history of technological progress. And you make the point that technology has not necessarily been as beneficial as we think of it because of how it has been distributed throughout societies, which seems extremely prevalent to what we're likely about to see with AI. Take us through that history. What is your reasoning for that? How does that play out?
Yeah, I think there are essentially several reasons why the full potential of a suite of technologies may not be realized or may not be realized quickly. One is monopoly. If one or a few companies dominate everything and they use that in order to extract all the rents, but also slow down innovation, that's one recipe for many good things not happening. So today, I think the digital world or communication world would be very different if AT&T had remained like the sole monopoly. So the breakup there probably opened the field for more shakeup. The second is, whether that technology is working with labor or is sort of just replacing labor, and worse, like during many parts of human history, is becoming a tool for repressing labor. Those don't work out great. I mean, slavery was not a very efficient system. It wasn't just bad for the coerced people, but it wasn't actually generating economic dynamism. At the time of the Civil War, the U.S. South was falling further and further behind, while the number of patents, innovations, industrial production, and all sorts of other things were advancing rapidly in other parts of the United States. So I think all of these things we have to sort of take into account. Is AI going to be a monitoring technology where workers become more and more powerless because there's so much data being collected about them? That's another concern that we don't often talk about. So there are many issues here that are intersecting, and we see parallels for each one of them in history. None of those are perfect parallels. We've never been confronted with a technology that's so widespread in its potential applications, but we've had other technologies that are quite transformative as well.
So how do we harness AI in a good way? I mean, what does regulation look like in your view, such that it is a net benefit to society versus a -6?
First of all, I think we need to be thinking about what it is that we want from AI. Of course, not everybody's going to agree on that, but at least that conversation needs to be had in a more open, constructive way. And second, we also need to be clear about what we mean by regulation. I think what most people mean by regulation is a reactive kind of regulation. Something happens, AI companies do something, and then we are worried about certain additional harms, and then we regulate that. I think instead, what we want is something more proactive. Let's think about where it is that AI can do most good, and ask ourselves whether it is going in that direction and what are the impediments for it not to go in that direction, and see whether we can do certain things to facilitate that. So if we did not do those facilitatory things, we would not have the internet, because that government support there was quite important. We would not have renewable technologies that are now, at least in certain applications, cost competitive with fossil fuels. So it's not like we have a sort of a law that says the market, or in particular a few companies that are steering technology, are necessarily going to choose the right paradigm. I think the market is excellent in doing certain things, but market participants are also locked in a particular type of business model often. They are going after a particular kind of prize, and it is possible to step back and say, well, is there another prize that...
It's just very difficult to think of another AI player of almost any importance globally outside of the U.S. Do you think that the U.S. is going to be able to maintain that type of lead in the AI ecosystem?
China has an engineering advantage. They have a huge number of engineers. They're generally well selected, meaning that more talented, quantitatively sort of skilled people enter into engineering because it's a very prestigious thing and they have exams that are relatively unbiased, and engineers are highly regarded. So when it comes to pure engineering things, I think China could have an advantage. On the other hand, the top-down system is hugely inefficient. There are so many places where inefficiencies build up. People are afraid of taking initiative. There is no decentralized sort of process. There, the US has an advantage. How that will shake out at the end would really depend. DeepSeek is an engineering marvel. They didn't come up with any of the new methods. The new methods that DeepSeek was using, some of them were invented by Google and OpenAI. Many of them were invented 20 years before by machine learning scientists. So they just took them, but they combined them quite well. How many more times can they do that? That's going to be one of the questions. And then, of course, it's not just US and China. Can other countries catch up? Europe is behind, clearly. But I don't think there is a law that Europe has to be behind. There are many talented AI scientists in Europe. They just happen to be all working in Silicon Valley.
I think this is a good segue into your 2012 book, Why Nations Fail. We're discussing how America could fall behind in the AI race. And it's interesting, you're kind of highlighting that on the one hand, there are some benefits to this top-down communist structure where you can set the agenda and the tone for the nation, the tone being, we love engineers and we love people who build AI. On the other hand, it can be a problem when you don't have the competitive forces of capitalism at work. It seems as though this is going to be sort of the defining question of our time, which one works.
100%. I think that's a very well put.
Which brings me to the question, why do nations fail? I mean, you've done Nobel Prize-winning research on this, the role of institutions. Why do nations fail?
It's mostly institutions. There are other factors, but many of these other factors, like just civil wars, are institutional as well. And the role of institutions, both formal rules, but also informal arrangements and norms, they become much more important when we're dealing with sectors that are forward-looking, innovative, require small players to scale up. All of those are things that the US was doing quite well. The United States had an ecosystem of startups that were extremely confident. People, when they opened, I knew many of them. I know many of them. Very few people think, well, if I launch a startup and if I'm successful, will I be shut down by courts? Will I be crushed by my competitors? Will I be able to get any contracts when my competitors are favored by the government? Nobody thought about that. Nobody thought about that, partly because I think people were on the optimistic side, but largely because U.S. institutions had a pretty good track record of not doing that. I think we're no longer sure. There are favored companies and not favored companies. Courts are much less impartial. Scaling up may become much harder when there is more uncertainty. So I think there are a bunch of issues where the institutional advantage that the U.S. economy had is more of a question mark today. And the problem is that when you mess up certain things, you pay the price right away. If you mess up institutions, especially as they pertain to innovations, you don't pay the price because the impact's not going to be felt for another 5-10 years. So if there are some fundamental negative effects from Trump's attack on, independent judiciary, the costs of that will be realized not in 2027 or 2028, but probably in the 2030s.
What is like the counterfactual to an institution-led society? Like when we talk about it's the societies that have had strong institutions, those are the ones that have worked out, and that's what your research has explained to us. What is the alternative? What is a society that is not led by institutions actually look like? What enters the void? How does that lead to a less prosperous path?
Well, I would think that every society has forms of institutions, but let's change your question to state-led versus not state-led.
Okay.
So Soviet Union was state-led, but too much state, not enough market, not enough decentralization, and that was horrible. But, Somalia, where clans ruled for several decades after the collapse of the state, is the other opposite. There are no state institutions that were functional. There's no third-party enforcement. There's anarchic ways in which even small problems would escalate. Neither of these two are great. Probably the Somalia is worse than the Soviet Union for economic activity, although probably the Soviet Union makes up for it by killing people more effectively. So I think that happy medium where there is enough decentralization of especially economic activity, but also other things like communication, dissent, etc. But there are state institutions that can be leveraged for doing good things, such as supporting innovation, providing public services, defense. I think that happy medium is hard to maintain, but many societies did maintain it for, several decades. U.S. did for longer.
Yeah, if I could sort of summarize what my takeaway from your research to be, it's something along the lines of this question of why are institutions even good for us? It's something along the lines of they prevent extreme concentration of power into the hands of someone who may not know what they're doing. That to me is the defining difference as to why there are societies that work out and there are societies that don't. As proven with the Soviet Union, you could argue maybe even today with Russia, where the institutions have been kind of taken over by Putin, and any other failed society. Is that right?
Absolutely. And if you look at the data, you see that, for example, economic performance under dictatorships is not just worse than democracies, but it's also more variable. And that reflects exactly what you're articulating, which is sometimes you're going to end up with a complete idiot as your dictator, and that's a real disaster. But even very smart people can be very dangerous because their incentives are not aligned with the rest of society. So Stalin didn't do a huge amount of damage because he was an idiot. He was definitely no genius, but he did know some of the things he was doing in terms of killing people and creating an enormously powerful secret service, secret police. So somebody who has the wrong incentives and the wrong motivations, even when they are talented, could do a lot of damage. So a democratic system via checks and balances, civil society mobilization, ability to change and kick out politicians when they don't do what they're supposed to do, I think creates a lot of pathways for not falling victim to that.
Given all of that, what do you make of what's happening in America today? What do you make of Trump's administration thus far? What do you think, what kinds of impacts do you think it will have on the economy?
I think institutions are really the secret sauce for the United States. The US is one of the most innovative economies in the world, and that comes because people are fairly confident that they can do new things and succeed. The American advantage in finance is also about institutions. During the global financial crisis, which was initiated, largely speaking, in the United States, what did foreign investors do? They put more of their money in the U.S. Why? Because during a crisis, they believe U.S. assets, equities, corporate debt, government debt are just much more reliable, much more liquid than the alternative. That's also institutional. You don't want to be subject to Chinese courts. You want to be subject to American courts. So all of those require a degree of independence in the judiciary and predictability and impartiality in the broader institutional rules. Trump's agenda, which is not unique to Trump, but is an extreme version, is to build a much more executive presidency, meaning the president has far greater power than what has been the norm, and the other branches of government and the agencies are not as powerful. I think that comes with a serious risk that those institutional balances are going to be disrupted. And we're already seeing that in terms of, corruption, in terms of people in the administration enriching themselves. But more importantly, I think a lot of uncertainty, for example, in the area of tariffs, what's going to happen next month to tariffs. That's the kind of uncertainty that strong institutions avoid. If that happens, that secret sauce that has been so valuable to the American economy will start disappearing.
We've been surprised at how well the economy, or at least the markets, have done, because we see the same issues you do: a lack of rule of law, lack of competition, regulatory capture. But meanwhile, it looks as if the American economy, and there's some warning signs, but we've been shocked at how well it continues to grind on. A, are you surprised? And B, do you think it's that there's just a lag, or that we're not seeing kind of the real issues here? Where is the state of the economy right now relative to what your perceptions would have been about it, given some of the concerns you've raised?
All of the above. So I think some of it is that there are lags. Some of it is that AI optimism is masking the problems. Part of the reason why the economy and the stock market are booming is because there's a huge amount of AI investment. Part of it is that, tax cuts would, if you did nothing else changed, and you just did a tax cut that favored capital, that would lead to stock market valuations increasing. And then the stock market is, of course, the incumbents. So if there are changes in the economy such that startups start having a harder time, that may not be great for the economy, but it's not going to be as bad for the incumbents that will be protected from the startups. So there are a number of layers here that I think are intersecting, but some of it I think is just that with tariffs, for example, we haven't seen their full effects on prices. We haven't seen their full effects on supply chains because, everything is changing so rapidly. I'm surprised. What I'm surprised by is, I'll tell you, Scott, is that people haven't been spooked as much by uncertainty. So the belief among economists, macroeconomists, was that uncertainty spooks investment. That hasn't happened. We've had a lot of uncertainty, and that hasn't really translated into people saying, well, let me hold back on my investments because I don't know what the future is going to look like. So that may be because of AI, maybe because of other things. I don't know.
When you look at America right now, what are your top concerns? You mentioned that institutions are the secret sauce of America. And it appears that institutions are under attack in some form or another, whether that's the BLS or whether it's the Federal Reserve. What are your major concerns for America right now?
There are several layers of institutions that worry me, starting from the top, not in terms of importance. I think I would have to think a little bit harder to give you importance weights. But first of all, our ability to control corruption, self-enrichment, enrichment of friends and family, those have become much weaker. Independence of bedrock institutions, judicial branches, that's much weakened, like FBI, like it or not. And there were many things not to like about it, but it had an ethos of independence and not being political. That's gone. There is a network of information provision institutions from the Government Accounting Office, Office of Budget Management, BLS, BEA, Census. Those are being weakened. So our ability to track the economy is going to be much weaker. And then, very fundamentally, because politics is becoming more conflictual and polarized, there are concerns not integrated in its best. The American system was much, much more integrated. Institutions in California and Cambridge, thousands of miles apart. they're still much more integrated than, those in different parts of Europe were. And that creating a hub like Silicon Valley or other places, at some point it was in Boston, that's very, very important. And you need that kind of concentration of energy. I don't think that it's impossible for Europe to achieve that. And there are several people who are thinking about that. For example, Mario Draghi of the European Central Bank fame sort of recently came out with a report asking much more investment in AI and digital technologies to sort of kickstart something at the European level. What will succeed, and when it's government directed, there are many risks, especially when you have the national bureaucracies overlaid with European Commission bureaucracy. So I wouldn't bet that it's going to work out anytime soon, but I wouldn't want to bet against it either. But also I think the world would be much healthier if we had a true multipolar world in terms of research, in terms of new ideas, not just US versus China, but US, China, Europe, but also something from the developing countries. There's tremendous energy in India, in other parts of the world about new techs, new ideas, new entrepreneurship, new risk-taking. I think the world would be just much richer if those countries also had their intellectual fingerprints on these advances.
We think a lot about the well-being of young men on this program, and something that I won't speak for Ed, has me suitably freaked out is the collision between AI and synthetic relationships that could potentially further sequester and isolate young men from relationships with their parents, diminish their desire to develop romantic relationships, establish friendships. Are we catastrophizing here? I see this as a disaster with no guardrails, and I can't tell if it's just as I get older, Professor, I'm getting more angry and depressed, or if I see something here. What are your thoughts about character AI, synthetic relationships?
I'm very worried, but not just for men. I mean, look, for social media, actually, the effect has been larger on women. I think many of these technologies that completely transform social relations have so many unforeseen consequences. Despite many mistakes and misdeeds that, Facebook, Meta, etc., Instagram did, they didn't set out to create a mental health crisis. That was a side effect. Now, with some of these things like character AI, they're actually intending to create, completely artificial bubbles. So, yes, I would definitely be worried about that. But the only thing I have as a small source of sort of silver lining is that they're not going to happen overnight. So these models are still going to be very clunky. So we still have some time. And that's why it's so important to ask the questions, what is it that we want from AI? Do we want, character AI and all of these synthetic relations and all of this isolation? Do we want, sort of how fast automation? Or is there something we can do with this very promising technology?
What field or what specific application do you feel holds the most promise for AI?
I think by its nature, AI could be revolutionary for many fields. Certainly, the process of science is already benefiting. We can do many more things. I think a lot of occupations that involve interaction with the real world in a problem-solving manner can really benefit from AI. So that's like electricians, plumbers, blue-collar workers, because they're engaged in series of problem-solving tasks. And AI-based, context-specific, reliable information could be a game changer there. A lot of other non-scientific creative occupations could get a boost as well. So there are actually a lot of different things that we could do. Healthcare and education are becoming a bigger and bigger share of national income everywhere. And those are the two sectors where we've had very little productivity gains. So macroeconomic productivity gains are held back because of these services. If we can do anything with AI to kickstart faster productivity growth in these sectors, that would be a game changer.
You've been described as the Wilt Chamberlain of economics. You are sort of a powerhouse academic, powerhouse economist. You've written books. You've taught at MIT. You've won a Nobel Prize. The list goes on. I'd love to, on the subject of institutions, I'd love to get your views on just the future of academic institutions right now. They've also been under attack in a variety of ways. How do you feel about academia as a field? Do you feel optimistic, pessimistic? What does the future of academics actually look like?
An important part of the institutional fabric of this society is also to provide foundational inputs into innovation via the academic educational process. And that's also in danger. Like, look, I think there were many things that were wrong with academia before Trump, but the current attack on the autonomy of universities cannot be justified by those problems. And I think it risks being more encompassing than those problems, whether you're going to call them DEI or whatever they are, ever could have been, because now funding and government control are all levers that a centralized authority can exercise over universities and academics. And whenever that has happened in other countries, for example, in my country of birth, in Turkey or in Hungary, you see the costs have been quite extreme.
Yeah, how does that play out? How do those costs materialize?
Well, first of all, I think very important projects that are forward-looking don't get funded. Today it's very difficult, for example, to get funding for mRNA vaccines. And those were going to potentially play an important role in fighting cancer and other sort of diseases for which we could, develop new vaccine-based approaches. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But even more importantly, I think when the autonomy of universities starts being threatened, people become more timid in their risk-taking, and that risk-taking there involves going against established ways or things that powerful actors believe. So I mentioned earlier on, in China, the top-down structure is really very costly. I think one of the costs you can see very clearly is in academia. In Chinese academia, despite the fact that you have very talented people selected into it and you have high degree of engineering or other expertise, it's much more political. So nobody wants to rock the boat, which means people are not really exploring more controversial topics, whether it is in social sciences or in physical sciences. And that environment, once it sets in, is very difficult to reverse. One of the great things about American academia was that sort of very risk-taking attitude, exploring things that are at the edges. That could become much harder.
Just observationally or anecdotally, from my perspective, I feel like academia and pursuing a career in academia has very recently gotten kind of a bad rap. It's almost as if academia, the expert class, there's this stuffy expert class that is either captured by wokeness or by, they're trapped in the ivory tower or whatever it is. And I see this among my friends, many of whom were going to pursue careers in academia and then decided, no, this world rewards entrepreneurs. This world rewards people who start companies and work for big tech. I'm wondering if you've seen that yourself. Have you seen that there is sort of a lesser interest in pursuing these kinds of careers?
I have, absolutely. And I think some of it is real and some of it is a perception. So indeed, I think there is the right kind of technocracy and the wrong kind of technocracy. As the world becomes more complex and there are more areas in which expertise, deep knowledge matters, you need technocracy. But you need technocracy to be accountable and to be sort of in conversation with the rest of community. So in some sense, yes, the wrong kind of technocracy has emerged to some degree in many countries where, experts, whether they are in universities or bureaucracy, sometimes know it best. But I think some of what you're describing is also an exaggerated feeling of, in fact, some of the things that those experts were saying are in fact true. For example, on vaccines or climate change, it's just that they did not communicate it very well, and the whole thing became unnecessarily politicized. And it's not just in academia. Look, for example, mRNA vaccines were not spearheaded by academia. They were spearheaded by startups and companies that thought they could really break the mold by doing something very different. So it's that whole ecosystem that's being threatened right now.
It almost feels as if our culture is just so dead set on finding out who are the experts, who are the people who are telling us how it is, and can we find a way to discredit them and tell them that they're wrong. And in a lot of ways, it seems ridiculous that to say, oh, it's the university professors that are telling us. It's like, actually, these are not the people who are in control right now. You're getting told a whole set of them.
They've never been. Exactly. I mean, they may be accused of being arrogant, that's for sure.
Right.
But that arrogance was never matched with real power.
Yeah, exactly. I wish more people could understand that. My final question, do you have any advice for young academics, for people who are interested in pursuing a career in academia, who are maybe asking those questions that we just discussed, as someone who's had so much success in the field? What would your advice be?
I get very frustrated when, people say, oh, you should work on this topic because this topic has, potential and there might be demand here. No, I think the real secret sauce in academia is you should work on whatever you're passionate about. And the best academic research comes when it's really sort of your own passions that you are following. And that's even more important when academia is under attack, because some of the great research can be done even when budgets are slashed, because you're just committed to it, and it's not about the biggest lab, it's not about the best measurement instruments, but it's about doggedly pursuing something that you feel is right and you can prove it.
Doron Acemoglu is an institute professor at MIT and co-director of the university's Center on Inequality and Shaping the Future of Work. He is also the author of 6 books, including the New York Times bestselling Why Nations Fail and Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology.
I think people who have money or grew up with money can sympathize with people that don't have money, but they can't really empathize. You always feel like there's a ghost whispering in your ear that you're not worthy. I felt like a ghost was following me and my mom around saying, oh, you f***ed up. You guys don't have money. You're not worthy. In today's office hours, we discuss being a founder and an introvert, navigating wealth gaps in relationships, and how to give your employees true ownership. Our first question comes from Initial Miserable 7914 on Reddit. They say, Prof G, I can build products, but I can't work a room. I have a product management background, and I've spent the past few years building AI automation tools and micro SaaS. What I don't have is the extroverted hustle gene or the network to attract the operators and capital needed to scale. Is there a path forward for introverted builders who can execute but can't sell themselves, or does the startup ecosystem just filter us out by design? I keep thinking about how many viable products are dying, not because they're bad, but because the person who built them isn't wired to pitch, network, and evangelize 24/7. Is this a solvable inefficiency in the market, or just how it has to work? Yeah, I think in almost every tech company, there's sort of a tech genius or someone on the team who is deeply introverted and awkward. And I'm not saying you're awkward, but it sounds like you're an introvert. And that's why the majority of successful companies are founded by not one, but several people. So my first company that I started, I share the same sentiment as you. I don't like rich kids. I have a bias against them. And I don't know if it's because I'm jealous or it's deferred anger from not having money. And that is, I think people who have money or grew up with money can sympathize with people that don't have money, but they can't really empathize. I just don't think people, and the story I tell is when I didn't get into UCLA, I'm like, I'm not going to college because I needed to live at home. I couldn't afford to go somewhere else. And as I've said several times, I ended up getting in on appeal. But I remember I lived in a wealthy neighborhood. We had kind of the shittiest condo on the block. My mom's boyfriend, who happened to have another family, bought it for us, but that's another story. But I was around a lot of kids, and what was happening when I went to UCLA, I was broke. There was me and one other kid out of 120 of us that everybody knew had no money. We were always late on our fraternity bills. You always feel like there's a ghost whispering in your ear that you're not worthy. I felt like a ghost was following me and my mom around saying, oh, you fucked up. You guys don't have money. You're not worthy. And it just kind of erodes your self-esteem, and you're not as confident. You're not as inclined to take big swings or risks. At least I didn't. And I remember being at a friend's house, and I was all bummed. I hadn't gone to UCLA, and the dad said, "Well, just get on a plane and fly out to Michigan or Indiana and show up and don't take no for an answer and speak to the admissions department and this big rah-rah speech, like get up." And okay, I didn't have a fucking credit card. I had maybe been on a plane a half a dozen times in my life. I wasn't going to get on a plane and go to fucking Michigan, to Ann Arbor, and just show up. I find that I resent rich kids because I just don't think there's any goddamn way. And then, by the way, a lot of them are just lovely and very nice. I just don't think there's any way they have any fucking idea about how hard it is to make money and make something of yourself when you don't come from money. If a university's mission is to create income mobility, like the most important university in New York is not Columbia or NYU, it's Pace, because it takes people who maybe didn't get tutors and all sorts of special time. That's my favorite now in these schools, is that every rich parent is convincing or writing a letter saying their kid has some acronym and that they need extra time. Back to you. Your resentment, I think, is understandable. I have figured out that, okay, enough already, or I try to be more generous and graceful and realize, like, good for them. They were born with money. Wasn't their fault to the benefit or the drawback. Doesn't mean they're not really good people. But I do find I resent them. I think it's because I'm a little bit jealous and insecure about my upbringing. But if you're really having trouble and it's kind of getting to you and sort of getting in the way or really eroding your confidence, I would suggest there's something deeper going on.
Particularly in the early growth stages of a company, of hiring and retaining great people and then getting out of their way. We recently hit a key milestone for our business of a profitable 1 million in annual recurring revenue. And in order to continue to scale, I know this is going to be critical to get right. You often say that if you want people to act like owners, you should make them owners. Do you have any advice on structuring ownership incentives for early employees? Right now, we offer small bonuses tied to revenue thresholds, but I just don't think it really creates that true feeling of ownership.
A company focused on consulting for landscaping businesses across Canada and the U.S. That's just so cool. There's so many cool ways to make money. Yeah, look, there's compensation and there's ownership. Compensation is people are going to engage in a certain number of activities in order to increase their compensation. But when you give them ownership, they start, they'll take out the trash from the snack room, or they'll think, oh, this would be a great business opportunity for another division, another part of the company. Whereas compensation, you usually outline what their metrics are, and they will study to that test. But when you make them owners, they're thinking about every aspect of the business and trying to contribute. And I find, give someone some equity, make them an owner, they become like you, and they start thinking about the business even when they're not working. And those are the most important people. I think in a small business, you want to find the critical people and give them chunks of the company. And that's what I've always done. And the mechanics are pretty straightforward. I would do an S Corp for a few reasons. One, I don't know if you've looked at 1202, but look at 1202. If you start a company, sell it 5 years later or more, the equity that you've held for longer than 5 years, if the company has an enterprise value of less than 50 million, which your company does, the first 10 million are tax-free. Actually, they've just increased it to 15 million. The best means of giving people ownership is usually through options on their equity, because then it's not a taxable event. If you give people equity, outright equity, it becomes a taxable event and they have to write a check. When they exercise their options, they will have to write a small check, because you do basically a valuation of 409A that says, all right, the company is worth $2 million. You're giving them options on 2% of the company. That's $40,000. And they're going to have to write a check for that, but they don't have to not until they exercise their options. Now, there's some other stuff. You want to exercise your options ideally a year or more before a liquidity event, because if you own it for longer than a year, you get long-term capital gains. But, individuals can figure that out with their own tax counsel. But essentially, awarding options is the most tax-efficient way to give people ownership. And I think that you identify those first 2 or 3 key employees, and that doesn't mean they're first. I was cycled through about 10 or 15 people to get to 2 or 3 key ones, and that's not pretty. But I think in a small business, it's fucking Vietnam. It's hand-to-hand combat. If someone's not adding a lot of value, you got to shed them and bring in someone else. But when you do find someone that's really outstanding, 1, you want to make them an owner. And 2, you want to outline your vision for the company around why that ownership will translate to real economic value. So at Prof G, I think we're going to continue to add voices. We're growing 20 or 30% a year. And by 2027, my guess is one of these traditional media companies or a new media company is going to panic and decide they want to be in the fastest growing ad-supported medium, which is podcasting, and will come in and likely acquire us. Now, none of us are going to get to go anywhere because we'll probably have to sign up for 4 or 5 year employment contracts. But I go through, when we do an all hands, I outline the vision for this company. I have a track record of getting to exits. and then try to say, okay, if this happens, this will be really good for people. And this is why. So the ownership question is important. It can also be phantom ownership through RSUs, or, there's all sorts of ways to give people different types of ownership. But traditionally, it's just an S Corp. And then you give them options. So it's not a taxable event when you award it to them. And they believe that it's real ownership. Also, if you're taking investment, I don't think it's a bad idea to try and do a secondary. What's a secondary? Say you want to raise $2 million and your round is oversubscribed, which is a good problem. Take and say raise 3 and take $1 million and buy people's shares. It's a chance for you to take some money off the table. And also, I do it proportionate. If I sell 10% of my stock to take some money off the table in a financing round, I'll let everyone else sell 10% of their holdings. There's something very powerful about when those options turn into money to really get people's greed glands going. Options structured with a lawyer. You can even do most of it on AI right now that gets people real ownership. And then just as importantly, outline the vision for the company such that they feel they have a piece of something run by someone who understands how to add value and is also looking for an exit, not looking to give it to their kids and there'll never be an exit. Congrats on your success. $1 million in recurring revenue. Just call it AI landscaping or something and go raise billions of dollars to buy chips. Anyways. Best of luck to you. That's all for this episode. If you'd like to submit a question, please email a voice recording to officehours@prof2media.com. That's officehours@prof2media.com. Or if you prefer to ask on Reddit, my sperm are not really swimmers. They're more like an old man browsing at a Costco who's looking for gluten-free peanut butter who just had cataract surgery. Like, it's well-intentioned, but it's just not going to reach the goal. I could do this all day.
I know.
By the way, I made up the last one myself, Ed. Ed, do you have a nickname for your sperm?
No, I'm not quite there yet. I'm not really going to play ball with you on this one.
Also, let me give you a little tip. Just while we're barreling toward cancellation, even Claire looks horrified. It's important and it's fun that every time you orgasm, you yell out the same thing. It's really important. You have to come up with the same thing. This is the part where you go, what do you yell out, Scott?
I told you I'm not playing ball with you.
Ed's got his face in his hands. This is not CM. Joe Kernan.
I'm not going to do you the service of asking the question.
Surrender, Dorothy. That's
okay.
what I yell out from the Wizard of Oz. That's what I yell out. And my other Wizard of Oz references, I yell out, I'm melting. That's why the fans tune in.
That's why they tune in.
Next up, JP Morgan chief economist for the last time. How are you, Ed?
I'm doing well, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm good. I've been in LA the last few days, and I'm at the Beverly Hills Hotel.
Nice.
Where they're charging me $1,800 a night so I can have a construction site above my room.
But they stopped the construction. I mean, just off mic here, you gave the front desk a call. You asked them to stop hammering, and they did it. Pretty baller. Good stuff.
Yeah. No, I carry a lot of weight here. Yeah. It's they're very scared of me.
Number one client. So what have been the highlights from LA just before we get into this conversation?
I had a dinner last night with like a small dinner with 8 people, and I'm totally name dropping. What the fuck? And Larry David, I sat next to Larry David.
Wow. How was that?
He is literally the same person in real life. It's not a show. It's a camera following around. He showed up. He's like, nice to meet you guys. Like, why do they serve hors d'oeuvres? He like goes into a bit. He's like, why would it? Like, I hate Uber. Do you hate Uber? Let me talk about Uber for. He's literally, I'm like, oh my God, it's the show. The guy just shows up and starts doing these bits. But he's very funny. He seems pretty nice. His wife is lovely. I don't know. I enjoyed.
How did you wind up at a dinner with Larry David?
I'm what you call right now like an intellectual support animal. And that is all these rich people think it's interesting to have me over for dinner and talk about my book. Like, so I think there's 2 or 3 of these people every year where they're like, okay, let's all get together. And also at the dinner was my role model, Sam Harris, and I enjoyed seeing Sam.
So when you get invited as the intellectual support animal, do you feel a pressure to provide the intellectual support?
Yeah, that's why you're there.
Is that fun? That sounds stressful. Maybe that's why Larry David was doing his bit. He was the comedic support animal.
The answer is yes, and I find as I get older, they called me, and they were going to invite this fairly famous tech couple, and I said no. I'm like, I just don't want to. I don't want to meet them. I don't want to talk about them. I find that stuff is increasingly intimidating me, and I don't want to. I mean, you know what? I'd rather just stay at home and watch Netflix and have some big Filipino man reheat my soup 6 or 7 times and just sort of start peeing in bottles, grow my nails really long. Surrender, Dorothy. Should we get to AI in the economy, Ed?
You want to move on now?
Somebody gave me mushroom chocolates over the weekend. Just saying. Just saying.
Okay, well, that explains a lot.
All right, let's get to the economy.
Okay, now that we know what happened in LA this weekend, here is our conversation with Michael Sembleth, the chairman of Market and Investment Strategy for JP Morgan Asset and Wealth Management. Michael, thanks for joining us again on Prof G Markets. Good to see you.
Morning.
So I'm going to dive right into the questions that we have because we've only got you for so long. Just some context. So last week, we had Professor Aswath Damodaran on our podcast. He presented what we think is kind of the most bearish position we've ever seen from him. And this is a very level-headed, calm guy who basically told us that he thinks that everything in the stock market is overvalued. He said there's no place to hide in stocks. And I'm just going to play you a short clip that kind of summarizes what he thinks right now.
To the extent that there's going to be a correction, there's no place to hide in stocks. I can't see a way, because if the MAG 10 go down by 40%, it's not like the industrials are going to hold their value while this happens. The panic that's going to create is going to ripple through stocks. You're an investor, primarily invest in stocks and bonds. My advice is, even though historically you might never have invested in non-financial asset categories, this might be a time where you think about, kind of at least moving a portion of your portfolio, bigger chunk than ever into cash or something close to cash, or maybe even collectibles, things that I've never owned collectibles, but, for the first time in my investing history, I'm saying maybe I should hold something that is not going to be affected if inflation goes to 10%. There's a market and economic crisis that is potentially catastrophic.
So we were very struck by everything he said in that interview. What do you think, Michael? Is he right? Are you concerned like he is? What are your reactions?
It's hard to react to somebody that doesn't have a long-term track record of this is when I bought, this is when I sold, this is what I bought, this is what I sold. Professors are basically running fantasy baseball teams by coming out intermittently and telling you what their trades are. It's not real money. It's not real life. And so, the purpose of Morningstar and Lipper and a lot of other entities out there is to kind of track the people that actually manage money. How do they do over the long run? And things like that. So it's a little abstract. A better example might be the cash stockpile that's accumulating at Berkshire Hathaway is probably a much better indicator of people that are having trouble putting money to work because they can't find any value. And certainly it's challenging right now. There's a ton of dry powder in private equity and venture that still has to be put to work. And so it's a challenging time. His premise of, I think I heard him say 10% inflation. Like I'm not prepared to quite buy into a 10% inflation forecast, nor am I prepared to buy into the certainty of a 40% correction in the MAG 10 or MAG 7. Those stocks have gone up a ton, and a passing wind could cause profit taking, right? Similar to what took place earlier this year with the dollar. Dollar went down 10%. It was at its post-financial crisis high. As soon as any asset falls by 10%, Nouriel Roubini and the rest of the people come out of the woodwork and say, okay, this is it. This is the big one. Everything's going to go down from here. And then, of course, the dollar's been flat since then. The dollar's been actually flat since our podcast in May. So the last time I was on this show, I think people have to have some kind of discipline to recognize that when assets are trading at 20 to 25-year highs, they can correct by 10 or 15%. It doesn't necessarily unfold and unravel into the big 40% corrections that we had in 2009 and then again in 2001. So it sounds, we're positioning more defensively than we have, but what he's describing there is a bridge too far. Plus, our normal balanced and conservative portfolios already have 30 to 40% in cash, cash equivalents, gold, very diversified hedge funds, municipals, some short duration preferreds and things like that.
Just to play defense for Aswath, that clip that we got was the most bearish string of sentences that he uttered. Otherwise, I think if you listen to the full podcast, it would sound less hyperbolic, perhaps. But in sum, he's concerned. But also, so is everyone else. And right now, this AI bubble, more and more people are talking about it. More and more people are Googling it. We're now beginning to see a little bit of a correction in tech stocks as we speak.
Small.
Small. The fears of this AI bubble are quite strong, or stronger than they have been before. What do you make of those fears? Do you think that they are warranted? And how are you at JP Morgan thinking about it?
Something like 75% of all of the revenues, profits, and capital spending since November 2022 have come from 40 AI-related stocks. So there's almost no justification to spend time on anything but this. And I try to be an even keel kind of person, but the meta number threw me. A company announcing that they're spending 65 to 70% of their revenues on capital spending and R&D without even knowing what the destination is that they're going to. As an investor, that doesn't fill me with a lot of good feeling about where we're going to be 2 years from now. And it was only 2 years ago that they did this. They reached the same peak of 65% of revenues investing in the metaverse, which obviously hasn't really turned out to be anything. So there's a lot more behind this particular generative AI boom, but the numbers, I put together something, Scott, I think you'd appreciate this, that you like this kind of historical context. The tech capital spending in 2025 is equal relative to GDP of the moon landing, the Manhattan Project, the interstate highway system, electrification of farming, the Triborough Bridge, the Midtown Tunnel, the Golden Gate Bridge, and the Hoover Dam
combined. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's all these futurists hovering around like bats telling us how all of this is going to magically make some fantastic future. And there are surely bits and pieces of evidence here and there of real productivity gains coming from this. But this is a scarier version of the ICT revolution of the early 90s. The only silver lining that I latch onto is that whether it's 2001 or the casino build out, airlines, fiber optics, the Calpine gas turbine era, all of those capital spending booms were financed with debt. And this one, with the exception of Oracle, is being financed with internally generated cash flow. But that simply means it can go on for longer before it gets unplugged by the debt markets. It doesn't relieve you of the ultimate need for there to be substantial profit generation to remunerate the $1.2 trillion of capital that's been spent since November 2022.
I want to recognize I'm feeling defensive around my colleague. I've been following Aswath for 20 years, and he does the work around valuations. And there's few people in the alternative investment space or investors that, at least in my observation, have been more right more often than him. And it did rattle us because he generally, and I want to acknowledge your point, it's easier to sound smart when you're a catastrophist. You just sound smarter, right? And the best traders, the best historians, the best politicians have erred on the side of asking themselves what could go right, and because the markets over the medium and long term are up and to the right. So I want to acknowledge that. I want to put forward a thesis and have you respond to it. And that is, if you look at every single of one of the companies we're talking about, they have all had years where they're down 50 to 70% in that 12-month period. And the thing that's scary now is if a company like NVIDIA, which hasn't had one of those years, I don't think, or maybe it did in 2022, if that happens to a company that's now got the market cap of the GDP of whatever, Germany, that might take the entire market down, that essentially America has become so fragile because it is now a giant bet on AI. And if OpenAI, which I mean, 60% of revenues on CapEx is one thing. As far as I can tell, OpenAI is about at 30 times 30 times the revenue going into CapEx. If OpenAI are some big customers, here's the thesis, and you tell me where I got this wrong. Some standard S&P companies, PepsiCo, Caterpillar, P&G announced, look, AI is great, but we are out over our skis. We're not seeing the return we'd hoped for. We're scaling back the investment. OpenAI in the secondary market trades way down, and then NVIDIA goes down 60%, which would not be unusual. It wouldn't look cheap. And then we have a $3 trillion destruction in the capital markets, and we basically overnight have flat markets, GDP growth of zero, and the whole market. If these companies sneeze, we're not catching a cold, we're catching pneumonia. The thing that worries me the most, and I want to get your response, is we have inadvertently turned our markets into a very fragile house of cards. There's the S&P 490 and there's the S&P 10. And right now, everything is banking on these 10 companies living up to these extraordinary expectations. Your thoughts?
I agree with most of that. One of the data points that was really disturbing is 2 years ago, someone talking about GDP growth would not have mentioned tech capital spending. It would have been a rounding error. Last quarter, it was a third of GDP growth. And US GDP growth would already be 1% if it weren't for this tech AI build out. And you know how people get upset when the private sector gets bailed out by the public sector? I would argue this year, generative AI has bailed out the public sector. Like the hyperscalers bailed out the Trump administration, because without them, they'd be staring a 1% GDP growth number in the face and having to explain it, which they're in really no position to do. And by the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that we track all of the country product tariff matrix combinations. The AI infrastructure, about 70 to 90% of those imports are exempt from tariffs right now. So those sectors and companies have also done a very good job navigating, however one has to these days, Washington, in order to get their imports, which are critical to their survival, exempt from tariffs. So yeah, I'm nervous about it. Again, the fact that it's being financed through cash flow means that we don't have quite the same risk of a sudden seize up, because bonds can't be placed. You're not going to have a hung bridge loan that gets like the broker dealers in trouble and have to go to the Fed's primary dealer credit facility. You're not going to have something like that. Oracle's really the only one that's financing any material amount of this through debt.
My understanding, so Oracle is raising a ton of debt, and it's capital markets are concerned about this, and we're seeing that reflected in the stock price. It's essentially underwater since the deal with OpenAI was announced. My understanding, though, is that the other big hyperscalers are going out and beginning to raise debt. We just saw a big announcement from Amazon. I think we saw that from Meta a couple of weeks ago as well. I don't know the exact numbers, but my understanding is they are going and financing this with a ton of debt. Perhaps not debt that they necessarily have to raise. Perhaps they have the cash surplus to finance this, but they are going and raising debt, and it's record amounts of debt that they are raising. Is that wrong?
Of the 40 companies I mentioned as AI stocks, 30 are technology, what you and I would agree are technology companies. 5 are capital equipment companies like GE Vernova that make the turbines, and then 5 are utilities. Let's look at the 30 AI stocks. Something like 25 of them actually have negative net debt to EBITDA ratios because they have more cash and cash equivalents on their balance sheet than debt. So for the most part, the debt's not an issue. The Oracle's an exception, and is in part a reflection of the fact that Ellison's been buying back stock for 15 years, and taking money out that way. At some point, Oracle's going to have to be recapitalized if it's going to be borrowing like this. The Meta deal was interesting, and when I explain how I view it, you'll probably say, "Well, that's even scarier than if it was Meta."
Let's hear it.
The Meta partnership with Blue Owl that borrowed $27 billion in the investment-grade bond markets was an SPV with a strange French name, and the debt's not consolidated onto Meta's balance sheet. Initially, I was concerned that was some kind of sleight of hand. It's not. It's worse. they basically have walkaway rights every 4 years and a declining residual value guarantee. Blue Owl's holding the bag. So Blue Owl is at risk if at any point Meta basically says, this we're not getting a return on this particular data center complex, we're out. And Blue Owl and the people that have put up the money for Blue Owl will be the ones holding the bag. So I think S&P was right to kind of withhold consolidation of that obligation, but it says a lot about the underwriting discipline that's taking place in private credit and in other places that are financing these data centers, because they're the ones that are taking the risk. It's essentially releasing risk, the likes of which you've seen forever in the commercial real estate markets.
So it sounds like someone is on the hook. In this case, it's Blue Owl, and we're probably seeing equivalents in these other debt deals.
Yes.
And by the way, we're seeing this kind of reflect in the stock right now. Blue Owl is publicly traded, and it's declining this week. But is the conclusion then, because it sounds like you agree with Aswath, we're seeing some form of a bubble. People are exuberant. There's a lot of hype and a lot of excitement that isn't fully tethered to reality right now when it comes to AI. But it sounds like where you disagree is the extent and scale of the damage that we're going to see if something blows up, or at least the likelihood that there will be some sort of blow up.
Last year was a perfect example. My forecast for the year was the Trump people were going to break something. We'd have a 15% to 20% correction, but stocks would end the year higher than where they began. It happened within 50 days of the inauguration. They broke everything. Markets went down. They eventually came back. I wouldn't describe any of the subsequent recovery as the byproduct of administration policy. But I think you and Scott are right, which is it would be kind of shocking if you didn't have some kind of profit-taking correction in 2026 at some point on the order of 10 to 15%. It would be, I'd be really surprised not to see
these companies, not the real economy, not the Main Street economy, not the 490 companies in the S&P that got to actually compete in the capital markets. But he has such a vested interest in the music continuing here that the government will step in and offer in some way to back the exceptional capital expenditures such that they can continue to make them, and that is only inflating the bubble to very dangerous territory. Your thoughts on that thesis?
That would worry me if I saw it. They've done a couple of things so far that I would, in fairness, put in a different bucket. Jamie is a very inspirational CEO. And one of the things I admire most about him is he calls it like he sees it, right? So they've done a couple of deals with MP Materials and Intel. Both of those deals fall under traditional industrial policy of trying to rescue supply chains that are rapidly diminishing in the United States with respect to domestic semiconductor production and critical minerals.
I think you're being generous. When they pick one company and take a stake and they take a golden share on one steel company, I would argue that is not structural, or there's not a systemic strategy there. That's the blood sugar of a man who thinks he can run these businesses better than the private sector.
I'm going to disagree with you on that one. And NP Materials in particular. They have provided a price floor on neodymium and praseodymium, which is needed by the U.S. military. It's the last man standing in that sector. If you told me that a presidential administration had to administer an industrial policy to pick winners and losers, this might be the last administration I would want to see do that. That said, you don't get to pick your time and place. And as things stand right now, China has a chokehold on those critical minerals, and whatever administration is in power is responsible for making sure, particularly with China flexing its muscles on export controls, that we start the process of trying to rebuild both mining and processing of critical minerals. If you can't do that, you've got a wide range of both renewable energy and military applications that will soon become untenable. That has to be done. I would have preferred for Eisenhower to do it, okay? But, I'm 63. So I probably would have preferred for George Bush Sr. to do it, right? I'm not sure I would have wanted Obama to do it. I'm not sure I would have wanted Jennifer Granholm to do it. But you don't get to pick your time and place. Intel was different. There's no guarantee of demand. There's no price floors. It's basically just a cash infusion. And based on everything I understand about Intel, their problem isn't money. So The worst thing about that one is I don't even think whatever it is they did is going to be very impactful. But I do expect to see more intervention by the administration in companies that represent the tail end of surviving supply chains, whether it's shipbuilding or anything else. And I'm not a heritage Cato guy, so I'm in support of that.
You oversee and kind of set the strategy and the narrative and the theme for one of the deepest pools of capital in the world. What, other than just moving to cash, and maybe that's the only thing you can do, how do you, I don't want to say become defensive, but just recognize that traditionally when stocks are this fully valued, the markets tend to have a pretty serious correction or go flat for 10 years. Like, how is your recommended asset reallocation? What has it been? What are you recommending to those deep pools of capital other than just going into cash?
So the answer to that question is, I think you'll find interesting, because it's less about changing the asset allocation of the different portfolios. It's more about explaining to clients that they may be better off switching from balanced to conservative or from growth to balanced. When we define the risk contours of a balanced portfolio, there are certain parameters that we can go outside of, but usually tend not to want to do. And so if we're really feeling that the risk return of a growth portfolio is changing, we would rather have the student body, change from being pre-med to pre-law and migrate down to the balanced portfolio risk, rather than have to turn the balanced portfolio or the growth portfolio into something it isn't. Because there's always going to be people with generational money or quite frankly, the city of Chicago, Cook County, Illinois, New Jersey, plans that are kind of on paper in extreme distress. Their inclination is to take a lot of risk. And so I don't want to change what a growth portfolio does, because there are people that are going to allocate to that and have every right to expect a growth portfolio to be positioned the way a growth portfolio looks. So part of our job is to explain to whoever wants to listen that the risk return is skewing because of where the valuations are. So you might want to kind of move down the portfolio chain.
What does a balanced or more defensive portfolio look like for those? I mean, just at a very high level, general level, like what does that portfolio look like? Bonds versus stocks?
You're talking about 30 to 40% of the portfolio being in some combination of cash, short-term A1, P1 commercial paper, municipals for taxable clients, super diversified hedge funds, like 30 to 40 of them, where like the vol turns out to be something like 5 or 6%, and some preferred stock, things like that. So you're kind of taking a lot of the directional beta risk out of it. You're obviously positioning much more defensively. Healthcare is trading at like the cheapest valuation on record relative to itself and relative to the market. So if you're going to take a position someplace, go someplace where you can be paid for the risk a little bit better, so stuff like that.
How is tech valued at large right now in terms of paying you for the risk?
The first thing people tend to do is say, I'm going to look at the PE of tech, and then I'm going to look at the PE of something else, whether it's industrials or basic materials, consumer discretionary or staples. But for 100 years, people have been adjusting PE ratios for growth, like for earnings growth, and ROE, and ROA, and capital efficiency. So and one of the things we do, and we share this in all our publications, is we plot both stocks and sectors and industries with return on equity on the x-axis and either PE or price to book on the y-axis. And so there's a lot more consistency to the way the market's valued once you adjust for earnings growth. Now, you may think the slope of the curve is too steep, and I wouldn't disagree with you. But to just kind of look at PE differentials is really missing the point that even before this generative AI boom, and we roll back the clock to 2019, the tech sector had double the margins of the rest of the market. They had become the things that the tech investors of 2000 would eventually dream they would be, which is highly capital efficient, low employment businesses with huge operating margins. So that's what they were even before this whole AI boom started.
Yeah, something that I was thinking about after we spoke with Aswath. I mean, his core valuation tool is the equity risk premium, which basically, he's taking the rate of return on stocks minus the risk-free rate, and he sort of plots that out.
Yeah.
And you're not a fan.
It doesn't have any nuance to it. It doesn't look at earnings growth and margin. It doesn't differentiate between sectors, and and I understand why people want to look at it. And over the really long run, it can be obviously a helpful tool.
Yeah, I think it's helpful. It's helpful when you're trying to take a bird's eye view and understand where we are in terms of sentiment. And the thing that kind of surprised me is, we're at around 3.7% by that measure. And, to be fair to him, he says, anything below 4% is a little bit dangerous. But we're also nowhere near where we were in 99 when it was around 2%. And, you're someone, I mean, you were a managing director during the dot-com boom and bust. You were the chief investment officer of JP Morgan during the 2008 financial crisis. So you've seen these cycles before. And I think what we're describing here is like, how do we put this in the context of not just tech versus industrials versus consumer, but how do we put it in the context of all of history? And what does this look like compared to previous crises and previous cycles?
I couldn't sleep in March of 2008. Like, I couldn't sleep. The things that we were seeing on a daily basis were so bad. And we knew that it was infecting the entire network of the financial system. And we went underweight both stocks and high yield. The only mistake we made is we didn't do more of it. Just to show you how hidden those risks were, JP Morgan, which is an exceptionally run bank, bought a couple of $1 billion worth of Fannie and Freddie preferreds that summer for its own balance sheet 3 months before they went to conservatorship, right? So that's how hidden the depth of the problems were. 2001 was easier because the companies weren't making any money. And so as long as you had some degree of discipline and support from your investment committee to go through a period of temporary underperformance as the market was rocking, you did fine, right? And so that, in a way, that was the easiest one. I remember we had this annual MD meeting, and the chairman at the time invited a company to come speak to us in 1999. He invited a CEO to come on stage and address all the MDs, and he was the CEO of a company called theglobe.com. So I pulled up theglobe.com on Bloomberg, and I hit DES, and it said, this company has no business model at the time. So we're sitting there, like, the chairman has invited a guy who runs a company with no business model to address us. I think we'll go underweight now, right? I mean, so that was pretty easy. This is a harder one because, in many ways, Google's one of the most successful companies in the history of the markets. I personally think their AI-related language model products are better than everybody else. And I think they're the long-term winners in this race. And so I have a lot of respect for what that company's accomplished. I have similar feelings about what Amazon and Microsoft are doing. But Microsoft signed a deal recently with Constellation Energy to turn back on a nuclear power plant in
3 Mile Island.
3 Mile Island. They've agreed to pay something in the neighborhood of $130 a megawatt hour. Now, most of your listeners don't know what that means. That's double wholesale power prices for an average 20-year PPA agreement. The other risk that we need to acknowledge is we're getting closer to a power wall that will prevent OpenAI from getting anywhere near, they've announced partnerships with Broadcom, Oracle, AMD, and NVIDIA that would require 30 gigawatts of power, which is the equivalent of 16 Hoover dams. That's just not going to happen. So what we're trying to figure out is how much of what's in the price of this whole AI boom is the expectation that these announcements are actually going to come to fruition under some 3 to 5 year time frame, because it's impossible.
Yeah, it seems kind of obvious to almost everyone that I mean, if you look at the numbers, when you see the amount of power that it's going to take to build out AI the way OpenAI would like, it's like, oh yeah, that's not possible. And one of the things that we've been talking a lot about recently is that crazy interaction between Sam Altman and Brad Gerstner. I don't know if you saw this, where Brad Gerstner says, you're making $13 billion in revenue. You plan to spend $1.5 trillion over the next few years. How are you going to pay for it? To which Sam Altman responds, if you want to sell your stock, you can. Be my guest. There are plenty of other buyers out there who would love to buy OpenAI stock.
It sounds like what happens when there's a syndicated loan distribution now on Wall Street. There's so much demand that if you press the button that says on the syndicate call, I have a question about the documents, you get disconnected. Like if you have a question on the docs, you don't need to be part of the syndicate. So those, I would agree with you. Those are the signs that are kind of telling me that we've entered into a period where the risk taking isn't there, that the underwriting has gotten sloppy. When we look at like in the innards of the private credit markets, private credit 5 years ago was substantially different than leveraged loans in really boring ways, having to do with maintenance covenants, IP blockers, and all sorts of stuff. And over that 5-year period, it's converging rapidly towards the leveraged loan market, which basically doesn't apply much of an underwriting wall at all. So we're kind of preparing for a profit-taking spark that comes from things we might not be able to anticipate, a violent, correction in overbid assets, and then some period of kind of recovery and calm that follows.
In a previous life, Michael, I used to take boards and management teams outside and do scenario planning as an exercise for how they allocate their capital. And if I were going to do this for a bank or anyone else, there's a couple scenarios I want to outline, and you tell me if they're realistic, if you think they might happen, and if so, how to respond. The first scenario is, all right, baked into these valuations of these AI companies is what I've read, the assumption that they're going to be able to find or inspire across their clients $3 to $5 trillion in incremental revenues or efficiencies. Now, I don't see a lot of AI moisturizer out there. What I do see is companies saying, okay, we're cutting our legal expenses. We're cutting compliance. There's real savings and efficiencies, which is sort of Latin for layoffs. And if you think that 160 million people in the nation work, if half of them are in industries immune to AI, chiropractors, welders, 80 million are quote unquote vulnerable. If you were to not inspire, which I have not seen a ton of incremental revenue growth from AI products, but all efficiencies, say $1 trillion a year, $100,000 average load per job, you're talking about a destruction in the labor market of 10 million jobs a year across the 80 million jobs that are vulnerable, or a 12.5% labor destruction per year in certain industries, which may not sound like a lot, but that's chaos. Or these companies' valuations get cut in half. I see this as a pretty definitive fork in the road.